Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip&Talk. It's your host, Joe, back at it again with another deep dive daily episodes. Starting to feel like running a marathon a little bit, but hey, at least we're doing it with a drink in hand, right? How about you?
You know, Joe, some days I wake up and I feel like I've solved all the world's problems.
Yeah.
And then some days I just need a double dose of caffeine just to even think about geopolitics, you know?
Yeah.
But then I see our listeners' questions and comments and it reminds me why we do this.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Speaking of our awesome listeners, one of you sent in a whole stack of articles about the UN, and it's got us thinking, does the UN actually have any teeth? We're going to be looking into a pretty big question.
Oh, yeah.
Can they actually make countries do things?
That's a good question.
It feels super relevant right now.
It does?
Well, with all the craziness going on in the world.
Definitely geopolitical tensions are high.
Like every time I turn on the news, it seems like there's another trade war starting. Some country's throwing a tantrum or something. I mean,
it's a lot.
Makes you want to just give up.
It makes you want to pour a drink, for sure.
Exactly. All right, so to get into this, we've been reading up on a few different things.
Like what?
Like the UN's role in the South China Sea dispute.
Oh, yeah.
And what's going on with nuclear safety. And we're also going to be looking at the upcoming election for the next UN Secretary General.
Right, because that could really change things.
You know, is the UN like a global powerhouse or just a paper tiger?
Well, Joe, the articles you sent in paint a very complicated picture. On one hand, you've got China just ignoring UN rulings in the South China Sea, building artificial islands like they're playing a real-life game of SimCity.
Yeah.
Then you've got Russia just wielding its veto power in the Security Council like a magic wand. It makes it really tough for the UN to take decisive action on issues like the war in Ukraine.
It's like everybody wants the UN to solve all the problems, but then they turn around and tie its hands.
Yeah.
So to kick things off,
I
came across something that I found super interesting.
What's that?
It seems like China is really proud of their seat at the UN.
Oh, yeah. They love that.
Especially when it comes to Taiwan.
Big time. They love to use it as leverage.
Just like they're saying, see, we're the real deal.
Right.
Taiwan, who's Taiwan?
Exactly.
But here's the thing that I found really strange. China also seems to completely ignore UN rulings when it's convenient for them. A perfect example is the whole South China Sea situation.
Yes, the South China Sea.
It never ends.
Never a dull moment.
So for those who haven't been following the saga,
Right.
China basically claims the entire South China Sea is their own.
Pretty much.
But in 2016, a UN tribunal said, nope, not yours.
Exactly. And that ruling was based on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
And guess what? China actually signed that.
Oh, wow. So you'd think they'd have to follow it.
Right. Like signing a contract and then be like,
yeah,
nah, I don't feel like following those rules anymore.
Well, that's basically what they did.
They just ignored it.
Basically, they kept building artificial islands. They beefed up their military presence.
So what's the point of even having a UN ruling?
Right.
If countries can just disregard it whenever they want.
That is the question, isn't it?
It really makes you wonder if the UN has any real power.
Yeah, they can make rulings and stuff.
But if there's no way to actually enforce them,
right,
then what's stopping countries from doing whatever they want?
Good point.
So maybe the UN can't force countries to do things?
Okay.
But does that mean it's completely useless?
Not necessarily. Remember back in 1971 when China replaced Taiwan's seat at the UN?
Yeah.
China seems to view that as a major victory, but it leaves Taiwan in a really tricky situation internationally.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Losing your UN seat. That's a big deal. That's like getting kicked out of the cool kids club, you know?
Exactly.
It makes it harder for them to be a part of global discussions, and it kind of weakens their position on the world stage.
Exactly. UN seats, they represent legitimacy and recognition on the global stage.
Right.
Even though Taiwan doesn't have that seat anymore, they've been trying to find ways to engage with the UN and participate in certain activities.
So it's like they're trying to crash the party even though they weren't invited?
Yeah, in a way. But it highlights how important the UN is, even for countries that aren't full members. I mean, remember the Philippines were the ones who brought the case against China?
Right.
And even though China ignored the ruling, it did give the Philippines some international support.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of shifted things a bit.
So the UN can't send in troops or impose sanctions, but it can at least provide a platform for countries to, air their grievances and maybe rally some allies.
Exactly. It's like being the referee in a game.
Okay.
You can call fouls and try to keep things fair.
Right.
But ultimately, it's up to the players to decide if they want to follow the rules.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So the UN sets the stage, lays down the law, but can't actually control what the actors do.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting point.
What's that?
The Security Council.
Ooh.
And those vetoes.
Yeah, those vetoes.
Any of the 5 permanent members, U.S., Russia, China, France, and the U.K.,
right,
they can basically shut down any action they don't like.
It's like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Pretty much.
So if one of those countries is involved in a dispute, they can just veto any attempts to hold them accountable.
Exactly. And we saw this happen with the whole Ukraine war.
Right.
Russia just vetoed any action against them.
So even though the world condemned their actions, the UN couldn't really do anything.
Yeah.
So it seems like the UN's power really depends on whether the big players are willing to cooperate.
Exactly. And this makes the upcoming UN Secretary General election even more interesting. Well, there's a lot of talk about a potential candidate from Eastern Europe, which could be interesting given Russia's stance right now.
Definitely.
And there's also a strong push for the first female Secretary General.
That would be amazing.
It would be groundbreaking.
But can the Secretary General really make a difference?
Yeah.
With the Security Council kind of looming over them?
It's a tough job, for sure.
It is.
They have to navigate all these complex geopolitical dynamics.
Right.
And try to build consensus between countries that often have very different agendas.
So maybe it's less about forcing countries to do things and more about using diplomacy and persuasion to influence their actions.
The Secretary General is kind of like the UN's chief diplomat. They have to be able to build relationships, smooth over disagreements, and find common ground.
That makes sense, but it still feels like they're walking a tightrope.
Oh, it is.
Especially when you have countries like China using their UN seat to legitimize their claims.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to Taiwan.
Yes. The Taiwan issue always adds another layer of complexity.
So China loves to use their UN seat to basically say that Taiwan doesn't exist as a country.
Yeah.
But then they turn around and ignore UN rulings that don't suit them.
Right.
Seems a little hypocritical, don't you think?
It definitely raises some questions about their commitment to the UN's principles.
It does.
Pretty much.
They want the benefits of being a UN member.
Right.
But they don't want to play by all the rules.
Exactly. And that puts the UN in a tricky spot.
But if they don't do anything,
it
undermines their credibility.
Exactly. It's a real balancing act.
They're walking a tightrope.
They are.
Because this isn't just about international relations.
It's not.
It's about domestic politics, too.
Absolutely. And things are getting pretty heated in Taiwan right now.
Really? What's going on?
Well, there's this huge movement to get rid of lawmakers who are seen as being too cozy with China.
Wow. So they're actually trying to vote these lawmakers out of office.
Exactly. But it's actually a reference to how a specific law was passed back in 2024.
Okay.
The KMT, or Kuomintang, which is the main pro-China party in Taiwan, they teamed up with another party to push through this law.
And what did this law do?
Well, it basically gave them more power and cut government funding.
Wait, they got government funding?
Yeah.
That seems like a bad idea, especially with all the tension surrounding China.
A lot of people in Taiwan agree.
Really?
They see it as a dangerous move.
Yeah.
A sign that the KMT is putting Taiwan's safety at risk by trying to appease China.
Okay, so this Bluebird movement is a direct response to that.
It is.
Like people are saying, enough is enough. We need to protect our democracy.
Exactly. And it's not just talk. As of February 2025, there were over 52 requests to remove lawmakers from office.
Wow.
And 36 of those were targeting KMT members.
So it sounds like people in Taiwan are really worried about China's influence.
They are, and it goes beyond just this one law. There's a growing sense that the KMT is playing a dangerous game.
By getting too close to China.
Right.
Which brings up a really interesting point.
What's that?
If Taiwan is internally divided on how to deal with China, how can they present a united front on the international stage?
That's a great question.
Like, how can they effectively engage with the UN if they're not even on the same page at home?
It's a huge challenge, and it makes it even harder for the UN to play a mediating role.
Because they're trying to find a solution that works for everyone.
Right.
But you've got these internal factions pulling in different directions.
Exactly. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
Okay, so we've got internal political struggles, external pressure from China, and the UN trying to hold it all together.
It's complicated.
This is getting intense.
Welcome to geopolitics.
And it gets even more complex when you add another layer to this whole situation.
Oh, what's that?
Espionage.
Espionage? Are we talking spies?
Maybe not James Bond level, but definitely some serious cloak and dagger stuff.
Like what?
Taiwan's government has been cracking down on suspected Chinese spies operating within its own ranks.
Whoa. So China is actively trying to undermine Taiwan from within?
It seems that way, and they've had some pretty high-profile arrests recently.
Really? Like who?
Well, just last week, a former KMT lawmaker was arrested on suspicion of selling secrets to China
Ooh,
in exchange for millions of Taiwan dollars.
that's a huge betrayal.
It is. So this isn't just about political disagreements anymore.
Right.
This is about actual espionage and potential threats to national security.
Exactly. And, well, think about it.
Right.
If China is actively trying to destabilize Taiwan through espionage and political manipulation,
Right.
it makes it even harder for Taiwan to assert its independence on the world stage.
Because they're constantly having to fight these battles on multiple fronts.
Exactly. And it also puts the UN in a difficult position.
How so?
Well, they're supposed to be promoting peace and cooperation,
Right.
but they've got this whole spy game happening right under their noses.
It's a messy
It
situation.
is.
And it really highlights the limits of the UN's power.
It's not just about what's happening inside Taiwan. It's about how the rest of the world, especially key allies like the United States, view Taiwan's willingness to stand up for itself.
Because if Taiwan's allies don't think they're serious about defending themselves, they might be less likely to step in and offer support if things escalate with China.
Exactly. And that's where the KMT's decision to freeze a large portion of the defense budget back in 2024 really comes into play.
Wait, they froze the defense budget
Yeah.
in the middle of all this tension with China. Why would they do that?
Well, they claim it was part of a larger effort to cut government spending. But a lot of people, especially those who are critical of the KMT, see it as a dangerous concession to China.
Like they're basically saying, hey, China, we're not really serious about defending ourselves, so maybe you can just, back off a little.
Well, I doubt they'd put it that bluntly.
Yeah.
But the optics aren't great, especially given the timing.
And what was the U.S. reaction to this? Because I imagine they weren't thrilled.
They were not. There were reports of U.S. officials expressing serious concerns about the budget freeze.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because if Taiwan weakens its defenses, it could have major implications for the whole region.
And it wasn't a good one.
So it's like they were unintentionally playing right into China's hands.
It's hard to say for sure what their intentions were, but the outcome is clear. It raised doubts about Taiwan's commitment to its own defense, which is exactly what China wants.
Okay, so we got a lot to unpack here. Taiwan's internal political struggles, the specter of espionage, and China's persistent efforts to control the narrative. But how does all this tie back to the UN?
Well, it underscores the limitations of the UN's power in situations like this. They can encourage dialogue, they can try to mediate disputes, but they can't force countries to prioritize their own defense or to make decisions that align with their allies' interest.
It's like the UN can set the table for peace, but they can't make the guests eat their vegetables.
Exactly. And sometimes those vegetables are crucial for survival.
So we're back to that core question, does the UN actually have any power?
It's a complex issue, as we've seen. They have the power to influence, to set norms, to provide a platform for dialogue. But ultimately, the real power lies with individual nations and their willingness to cooperate or not.
And in the case of Taiwan, that willingness is constantly being tested.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act, and the stakes are incredibly high. And it raises another important question: how much does a country's internal politics affect its standing on the world stage?
That's a good question. Because it feels like there are two levels to this whole thing, what's happening inside Taiwan and how that plays out on the world stage.
Right. And those two levels are constantly interacting and influencing each other. Take the Bluebird movement, for example. It's a grassroots movement, but it's sending a message to China and the rest of the world about what the people of Taiwan want.
Which is basically to stay as far away from China as possible.
Essentially, yes. They want to preserve their democracy, their autonomy, their way of life. And they're not afraid to fight for it, even if it means going up against a powerful neighbor like China.
So does that mean Taiwan's internal politics are actually strengthening its position internationally?
It's complicated. On the one hand, a strong and unified domestic front can definitely make a country more credible on the world stage. But on the other hand, internal divisions can create vulnerabilities that other countries, especially those with less than friendly intentions, can exploit.
Okay, so it's like a double-edged sword. A strong internal front can boost your international image, but infighting can weaken it.
Exactly. And that's why the upcoming UN Secretary General election is so important. Whoever takes on that role will have to navigate these complexities with a lot of finesse.
Right, because they'll be dealing with countries that have very different agendas, and they'll have to find ways to build consensus and move things forward.
It's a tough job. And it makes you wonder, what are the qualities of a good UN Secretary General? What kind of person can actually make a difference in a world that's so divided?
That's a great question. And I think it ties into something we've been circling around this whole episode, the balance between idealism and realpolitik.
Ah, yes, the eternal struggle.
Right, because the UN is founded on this ideal of international cooperation and peace. But the reality is that the world is full of competing interests and power struggles.
Exactly. And a good UN Secretary General needs to be able to bridge that gap. They need to be both a visionary leader who can inspire countries to work together and a shrewd diplomat who can navigate the realities of global power dynamics.
It's like they need to be both a dove and a hawk at the same time.
That's a great way to put it. They need to be able to soar above the fray and see the bigger picture, but also be ready to swoop down and fight for what they believe in.
So they need to be tough, but also compassionate.
I know.
Idealistic, but also realistic? It sounds like a pretty impossible job.
It's not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. But the right person with the right skills and the right vision can make a real difference.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the UN and its role in the world. But what about us, the everyday people? Where do we fit into all of this? Do we have any power to influence global events?
That's a question I think about a lot. And honestly, I think the answer is yes. Maybe not in the same way that world leaders do, but our actions, our choices, our voices, they all have an impact.
Like what we buy, who we vote for, what we post on social media.
Exactly. Take Taiwan, for example. The Bluebird movement is a perfect example of how people power can create real change. It's not just about voting, it's about raising awareness, mobilizing communities, and holding leaders accountable.
So it's about being informed, engaged, and active citizens.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that even small actions can have ripple effects. When we support businesses that align with our values, when we speak out against injustice, when we choose to learn about different cultures and perspectives, we're contributing to a more just and peaceful world.
That's really inspiring. It makes me feel like I can actually make a difference, even if it's just in my own little corner of the world.
You absolutely can. And don't underestimate the power of connecting with others who share your values. Together, we can amplify our voices and create real momentum for change.
So what you're saying is that global citizenship starts at home.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, understanding the impact of our choices, and using our voices to advocate for a better world.
And it's about staying curious and engaged, like we're doing right now on Sip&Talk.
Absolutely, because knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the world, the better equipped we are to make a positive impact.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. But I have to admit, all this talk about geopolitics and global challenges can be a bit overwhelming sometimes. What do you do when you need a break from the heavy stuff?
Well, sometimes I just need to unplug and escape into a good book or movie. But other times I find it helpful to focus on the positive things happening in the world, like the incredible work that people are doing to promote understanding and connection across cultures.
Ooh, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, have you heard of this amazing YouTube channel called Mickey to Life?
Wait, the one that showcases Taiwan and has those awesome whiskey reviews.
That's the one. They're doing such a fantastic job of highlighting the beauty, the culture, and the people of Taiwan, and they're reaching a global audience with their positive and engaging content.
I know, right? It's like a breath of fresh air in a world that can sometimes feel pretty heavy. And speaking of fresh air, I think we need to wrap up this episode before our brains explode from all this deep thinking.
Agreed. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a thought. We've talked a lot about the power of the UN, the challenges facing Taiwan, and the role we can all play as global citizens. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is to stay hopeful.
Hopeful, even with all the conflict and division in the world.
Especially with all the conflict and division, because hope is what fuels our desire for a better future. It's what drives us to work for peace, justice, and understanding. And it's what reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's always light to be found.
I love that. So our challenge to our listeners is to find that light, to hold on to hope, and to never stop believing in the power of human connection.
Beautifully said.
And remember, even small actions can make a big difference. So go out there, spread some kindness, learn something new, and keep those conversations flowing.
Cheers to that. And until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
The world needs you.